At 19, I met Ebony, and like many young love stories, it was filled with passion but also emotional abuse. The first time we locked eyes, there was something magnetic about her. She was vibrant, confident, and carried herself in a way that made me feel alive. I thought it was love, the kind everyone talks about, intense, consuming, and overwhelming. But looking back now, I see how much of that love was built on manipulation, harsh words, and constant emotional turmoil. It wasn't immediately obvious. At first, everything seemed like the typical whirlwind romance. We spent days together talking about our dreams, our futures, everything felt so perfect. But over time the cracks started to show. It began with the little things, insults disguised as jokes, snide remarks hidden behind a smile. "You're stupid," she'd say when I made a mistake. "You're never going to amount to anything," she'd sneer when I was down. It wasn't just one-off comments either. They were consistent, repeated over and over until I began to believe them. I found myself questioning my worth. I began to doubt my abilities, my potential. And she knew exactly how to press those buttons. The fights became more frequent. Words would fly, sharp and venomous. I remember one argument in particular where she screamed at me that I was worthless, that I would never be anything but a failure. And in those moments all I could do was stand there, silent, taking the blows. She seemed to take pleasure in my pain, as though hurting me was a way of feeling in control. But even in those darkest moments, there were flashes of affection that made me want to stay. A hug after the fight. A kiss when things felt right. And for a while, I told myself that those moments of kindness meant something. That love was messy and this was just part of it. Maybe we were just figuring things out. But the abuse kept coming, and it became clear that it wasn't just part of the process. It was the foundation of our relationship. Words became weapons, and no matter how much I tried to fight back, I always found myself losing. I started believing her. I started thinking that maybe she was right, maybe I wasn't good enough. I couldn't get out of my head, and it felt like no matter how hard I tried, things never improved. In fact, they only seemed to get worse. But I stayed, like many do when they're young and caught up in the whirlwind of emotion. The idea of walking away seemed impossible. There was this invisible thread that kept pulling me back in. It was love, or so I thought. But as time went on, something inside of me shifted. The hurt started to outweigh the love. I realized that no matter how much I cared for her, I couldn't keep accepting this abuse. It wasn't love anymore, it was toxic. It was breaking me, and I couldn't let it break me any longer. So, after 2 years of enduring this emotional roller coaster, I finally reached my breaking point. I walked away. I left. And I took my son with me. After 2 years of this pain, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The weight of the emotional abuse, the constant arguing, the cruel words, it was slowly destroying me. I had tried for so long to make it work, to hold on to something that wasn't healthy, hoping it would get better. But deep down, I knew it was never going to change. I had to protect myself, and more importantly, I had to protect my son. Leaving Ebony was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. The love I thought we shared had faded long ago, but the idea of leaving still felt like a gut punch. I wasn't just walking away from her, I was walking away from the life we had built, the life I thought was my future. But I knew staying would only mean more pain, more self-doubt, and more broken promises. I remember the night I finally decided. We had just had another one of our terrible arguments. It was the same cycle as always, hurtful words, raised voices, and me, emotionally drained, standing there wondering how much more I could take. I could feel my soul slipping away piece by piece. I looked at my son, sleeping soundly in his crib, completely unaware of the chaos around him. It was in that moment that everything became crystal clear. I couldn't continue exposing him to this. I couldn't let him grow up thinking that this was normal. The next morning I packed my bags. I knew that leaving Ebony wouldn't be easy. There would be fights, accusations, and manipulation. She would try to make me feel guilty for leaving, just as she always did when I stood up for myself. But this time I couldn't be swayed. I had to be strong, for me and for my son. When I told her I was leaving, I'll never forget the look on her face. There was a mixture of anger, disbelief, and confusion. She didn't understand why I was leaving, and for a split second, I almost felt bad for her. But then I reminded myself of everything that had led to this moment. The name-calling, the constant belittling, the emotional toll. No one deserves to live like that. Not me, not her, and certainly not my child. "I'm taking him," I said, my voice steady but firm. Her response was a mix of denial and anger. She told me I couldn't take our son, that I was being unreasonable, that I was abandoning her. But I didn't listen. I packed up what I could, put my son in the car, and drove away. As I left, I couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. There were moments when I had loved her, and part of me still wanted to believe that things could have been different. But I had to face the truth. This relationship was toxic and it was suffocating me. In the days that followed, I was filled with a strange combination of relief and guilt. Relief because I knew I was doing the right thing for my mental health, but guilt because I still cared about Ebony in some way. I knew she wasn't a bad person. She had just become lost in her own pain and insecurities. But I couldn't save her anymore. I couldn't carry the weight of her self-destructive behaviors. I focused on my son, who needed me more than anything. I moved on with my life, but it wasn't easy. I had a lot of healing to do, a lot of growing up to do. But I also knew that I had to learn from the mistakes I had made in that relationship. I couldn't allow myself to fall into the same patterns again. I had to become stronger for my son, for my future. Leaving Ebony was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was the most important decision I could have made. It wasn't just a step away from her, it was a step toward my own future, a future where I could finally heal and build a life that didn't revolve around pain and regret. It was the beginning of a new chapter, and though I had no idea where it would lead, I knew I had to take that first step. Before we parted ways, I told her something that stayed with me for years: I will not lose. The words came out before I even fully understood their weight. In the chaos of that moment, amidst the tears, anger, and finality of it all, those words felt like a promise to myself. They were a declaration that no matter what happened next, I would not let this define me. I would not let this relationship, this heartbreak, or this pain break me. I would rise above it. I will not lose. It wasn't just about leaving Ebony or ending our relationship. It was about fighting for myself, for my sanity, and most importantly, for my son. I had spent so much time doubting myself, thinking I wasn't enough or that I couldn't be the father I needed to be. I had let the toxic environment we were in cloud my judgment and my self-worth. But now, with those words echoing in my mind, I knew it was time to take control of my life. That moment sparked something in me, an unshakable determination to rise above the pain and the failure I felt. It wasn't just about escaping the cycle of toxicity, it was about rebuilding my identity from the ground up. I realized that I didn't have to be a victim of my circumstances. I could choose to fight for something better, something healthier. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into this new resolve. I sought therapy to work through the emotional scars that had been left behind. I focused on being a better father to my son, making sure he grew up in a loving, supportive environment, one that was free from the emotional chaos I had lived through. The road to healing wasn't easy. There were days when I still found myself haunted by the memories of our time together. The guilt would creep in, making me question if I had done the right thing. But then I would remember the look in my son's eyes, the way he needed me more than ever. I couldn't afford to be weak, I couldn't afford to let the past control me. I had to be strong not just for him but for myself. I will not lose. It became my mantra, my reminder whenever I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. It was a constant push to keep going, to keep growing, to never allow myself to fall into the same toxic patterns. I had to change, to evolve into someone who was stronger, wiser, and more resilient than before. The determination I felt was like a fire inside me, burning away the doubt, the sadness, the regret. I realized that in order to heal, I had to stop looking backward and start looking forward. I couldn't keep holding on to the past. It wasn't going to help me move forward. As I began to rebuild my life, I started setting goals for myself. I worked on developing new habits, on finding purpose beyond the confines of my past relationship. I went back to school, started pursuing things I had always wanted to do, things that were mine and mine alone. It wasn't just about making a living, it was about making a life. I was no longer going to be defined by the person I was in that relationship or by the things that went wrong. I was going to define myself, carve out a new identity, one that was stronger and more resilient. And through it all, those words I had said to Ebony echoed louder with every passing day. I will not lose. It was a promise I made to myself, and it became the foundation of everything I built in the years that followed. I realized that while love can be painful, it can also be a catalyst for growth. Through the pain of loss, I had gained strength. I had gained clarity. And most importantly, I had gained the will to never give up, no matter how hard life got. In the end, I didn't lose. I learned to rise, to rebuild, and to face each day with the understanding that I had the power to overcome anything. And that was worth everything. After leaving Ebony and everything that had transpired, I felt like I had started anew. I focused on healing, building a better life for my son, and making sure I was in a place where I could be the kind of father and man I had always wanted to be. It wasn't easy, but I was determined. I felt like I had closed one painful chapter and was ready to open a new, brighter one. And that's when she came into my life. Her name was Maria. She was different from anyone I had ever met. She had this calming presence and effortless kindness that made me feel safe. She wasn't just my partner, she was my equal. Together, we created a home full of laughter, love, and hope. It was everything I had dreamed of when I had imagined a future after leaving the toxic relationship with Ebony. Maria supported me through my healing, and we worked together to raise my son, giving him the stability and care that he deserved. We got married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by close friends and family. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was building something real, something lasting. Maria wasn't just a partner, she was a teammate, someone who shared my values and vision for our future. We bought a home, created new traditions, and became a family. But just when I thought everything was finally falling into place, just when I felt like I had left the past behind, that's when the unexpected happened. It started with a message. It was brief, almost like an afterthought, but it carried a weight that I couldn't ignore. Ebony had reached out. At first, I thought it was just another one of her attempts to stir up trouble, something to pull me back into her world. I had learned the hard way to guard myself against her manipulations. But this time was different. Her message was simple and calm. There was no anger, no blame. She asked if we could talk. At that moment, a wave of unease washed over me. The past, which I had worked so hard to leave behind, was creeping back into my life, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this would somehow disrupt everything I had built with Maria. I didn't want to go down that road again. I didn't want to reopen old wounds. But I also understood that there were things left unsaid, unfinished business between Ebony and me. She was the mother of my child, and no matter how much I had distanced myself from her, we still shared a bond because of our son. So I agreed to meet with her. I couldn't predict what would happen, but I knew I had to face this chapter, for the sake of my son and my own peace of mind. When we met, it was clear that this wasn't a conversation about reigniting anything between us. She wasn't asking to get back together or even to reopen old wounds. Instead, she had a request. One that would force me to reconsider everything I had built with Maria and the life I had moved on to. Ebony told me that she had gotten involved with someone new, someone who was willing to help her financially, but there was a catch. She needed something from me. She asked if I would be willing to help her with a large sum of money to keep her life stable and support our son in the way she believed was best. She said that the father of her new partner could provide the funds, but only if I signed a legal agreement to cooperate with her. The request shocked me. Here I was, with a new life, a new family, and the stability I had fought so hard to create, and now I was being asked to step back into a world I had promised myself I would never return to. There was a part of me that felt conflicted. I didn't want to be cold-hearted, and I wanted to ensure that my son had everything he needed. But there was a much larger part of me that was scared that agreeing to help her would pull me back into the same unhealthy patterns that had once defined our relationship. Scared that it would jeopardize the trust and love I had worked so hard to build with Maria. I thought about it long and hard. I weighed the consequences of opening up old wounds, of being dragged back into the drama, of potentially hurting Maria in the process. This was no longer just about me and Ebony, it was about the life I had created with Maria and the future I wanted for our family. I realized that the request wasn't just about money, it was about control. It was about Ebony trying to pull me back into her orbit, trying to make me feel obligated to her once again. And for the first time in years, I saw it for what it truly was. I didn't need to make any promises to her. I didn't owe her anything beyond being a responsible father to our son. I knew the answer was no, but I still had to say it. And so I did. I told her that I couldn't help her the way she was asking. I told her that I had moved on, that my life had changed, and that I would continue to support our son in the ways that were healthy and appropriate. But that was where the line had to be drawn. She didn't take it well. There was anger in her voice, frustration, but I stood my ground. When I returned home that night, Maria could see something had shifted in me. She didn't ask me what happened, she knew. She knew that I had just faced a moment of temptation, a moment where I could have gone back into the chaos of my past, but I had made the right decision for us. She didn't need to say anything. She just held me and that was enough. I had passed the test. I had chosen my family, my peace, and my future. The decision to say no wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And in doing so, I reaffirmed the truth I had told myself years ago. I will not lose. I wouldn't lose my sense of self, my stability, or the family I had built. I was starting a new chapter, and this time there was no going back. It had been years since I left Ebony, and life had unfolded in ways I never imagined. I had built a family with Maria, found peace within myself, and established the kind of stability I had always yearned for. But life, as it often does, threw another curveball my way. It was a quiet afternoon when Ebony contacted me again. This time it wasn't about money or drama, but something that felt more pressing. She had a new request, one that caught me off guard. "Can you help me?" she asked, her voice softer than I'd ever heard it. It wasn't the usual manipulative tone I had come to expect. She wasn't asking for a favor to serve her interests, but for something much bigger. She needed me to take in her daughter. At first I didn't know how to react. Her daughter, who wasn't even my child, was still very much a part of the picture, caught in the complicated web of relationships and dysfunction that had defined Ebony's life. The girl, a few years younger than my son, had been living with Ebony but was now in a difficult situation. Ebony's new partner had issues of his own, and the environment had become unstable. She said that the child was often neglected, and for her own safety, needed a place to stay. I didn't know what to think. My life was finally settled, my family was happy, and the idea of taking in someone else's child felt like a huge responsibility. But as Ebony spoke, I could hear the genuine concern in her voice. I could sense that this wasn't a plea to manipulate me, but a real call for help. And I knew that this wasn't just about my past with Ebony, it was about doing what was right regardless of history. Maria and I had always talked about what it meant to be a parent, the responsibility we shared in raising our son, and the values we wanted to instill in him. We had always agreed that family, regardless of the complications, was about support, care, and doing what was best for the children. This wasn't just about taking in a child, it was about showing my son what it meant to be a good person, a compassionate person. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I couldn't just turn my back. I couldn't walk away from the possibility of helping a child in need, even if it meant complicating my life. I wasn't the same person I was when I was with Ebony, and I had grown stronger. This time I could do it differently. I could handle this responsibly without allowing the past to cloud my judgment. So, I told Ebony I would take in her daughter. The decision wasn't easy. I knew that Maria and I would have to adjust to this new dynamic, and I was concerned about how this would affect our relationship. But Maria, as always, surprised me with her strength and compassion. When I explained the situation to her, she didn't hesitate. She understood the importance of helping someone in need, especially when it involved a child. Together we made room for her daughter. We set up a space for her in our home, and despite the challenges that came with the adjustment, we were determined to make her feel welcomed and loved. We weren't just giving her a roof over her head, we were offering her stability, safety, and a chance to grow up in an environment that was free of the chaos that had defined her past. The girl, whose name was Emma, was understandably wary at first. She had witnessed a lot of hurt and uncertainty in her short life, and trusting others didn't come easily to her. But slowly she began to open up. We spent time with her, listening to her, learning what she needed, and helping her navigate the confusing emotions she had. Maria was patient with her, providing a calm presence that Emma desperately needed, and I made sure to be there for her as a father figure, even though I wasn't her biological father. It wasn't without its struggles. There were moments when Emma acted out, times when she felt out of place or missed her mother. But those moments were part of the healing process, both for her and for me. In a way, taking her in felt like I was creating a new chapter for myself, one where I could show up for a child who needed help, regardless of the complicated history with her mother. As time passed, Emma began to thrive. She was doing better in school, building a bond with my son, and learning to trust again. It was a slow process, but it was working. I saw her begin to open up, to smile more, and to find her place in our family. And in the process, I began to understand something about myself. That my capacity for love and care wasn't limited to just my own child. I had room for more, and I could provide that same stability and love for Emma that I had worked so hard to give my son. Taking in Ebony's daughter wasn't just about fulfilling a responsibility, it was about showing up when it mattered most. It was about choosing to do the right thing, even when it wasn't easy, and realizing that sometimes, doing the right thing means breaking away from the past and creating a better future for everyone involved. I had been given a second chance at life, at love, and at family, and I was determined to make the most of it. This wasn't just about taking in a child, it was about creating a home that was safe for both of my kids, no matter their backgrounds, and teaching them the importance of compassion, responsibility, and family. We weren't just a blended family, we were a family plain and simple. And together, we would continue to build something stronger than the broken pieces of our past. For 5 years I waited. I wasn't waiting for something grand, some miraculous change, but I did hold out hope that Ebony would fulfill the promise she had made to herself and to our child. The promise she had made when she said she would turn things around. When I first took Emma in, I did it with the belief that Ebony would eventually get the help she needed. I wanted to give her the time and space to figure out her life, to go back to school, to get a stable job, and to become the kind of mother Emma deserved. I wasn't expecting perfection. Hell, I didn't even expect her to suddenly become a flawless version of the parent I had always hoped she would be. But I did expect progress. I had grown so much over the years. I'd built a family with Maria, learned to navigate the complexities of fatherhood, and I had learned to prioritize stability and consistency. All of this time, I had hoped Ebony would follow suit. But 5 years passed and nothing changed. It was a slow, painful realization. At first, I made excuses for her. She's struggling with life, the system is against her, she just needs more time. But as the years wore on, those excuses grew thinner, and the hope I had once held for her began to feel more like an anchor, dragging me down. There were always stories. There was always something. I'm starting school next month, I've got a job lined up, I'm getting clean, just need a little more time. And for a while I believed her. I kept hoping that one day she'd call me and say she had turned the corner, that she was ready to be the mother Emma needed. I wanted to believe that she could be better for Emma, for herself, and for the sake of our past. But that moment never came. Instead, Ebony's life remained stagnant. She'd drift in and out of unstable relationships, often relying on others for support, but never really finding any stability. She'd call occasionally, but not to check on Emma, just to vent about her struggles. Sometimes she'd ask for help with money or for a place to stay, but I had learned the hard way that helping her never led to real change. It was just another cycle of dependency, manipulation, and disappointment. I had tried to set boundaries. I told her, if you want a better life for Emma, you need to do the work. You need to show me you're serious about changing because I can't keep making excuses for you. But every time it was the same. Empty promises and vague plans that never amounted to anything. It became clear to me that no matter how much time I gave her, no matter how much I wanted to believe in her potential, she wasn't willing to do the hard work that was required to make those changes. I couldn't keep waiting. I couldn't keep putting Emma through the emotional turmoil of watching her mother drift further away, unable to take responsibility. Emma deserved more than that. She deserved a mother who was there for her, not just in moments of convenience but every day, someone who could provide the stability and love she needed to thrive. The tipping point came when I realized that I was holding on to a fantasy, not the reality of who Ebony had become. I wasn't doing her, or Emma, a favor by waiting around for a change that would never come. I was just prolonging the inevitable, and in doing so, I was compromising the life that I had worked so hard to build. It was painful, but I had to accept it. Ebony wasn't going to change. She hadn't even started. I couldn't keep letting her take up space in my life, emotionally or physically, when she wasn't willing to step up and take responsibility. I had already made the decision that I was going to be the best father I could be for Emma, but it was clear I couldn't do that while waiting for Ebony to pull herself together. And so, I let go. I stopped waiting. I stopped believing in the false promises she kept making. I stopped trying to fix her. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. In the end, I realized that some people are not capable of change, at least not in the ways you hope. I couldn't continue to hold on to the dream of the mother Ebony might become. Instead, I needed to focus on the reality of the situation. Emma needed a stable, loving home, and I was the one who could provide that. It hurt deeply. It was hard to let go of the hope that one day Ebony might come through for Emma, but I couldn't keep sacrificing the stability of my family for a promise that wasn't being kept. And as much as I wished things could have been different, I knew I had to make peace with the fact that not all stories have a happy ending. Emma was the priority now, and I had to stay focused on giving her the best future I could. I had already been there for her when she needed me most. Now, it was up to me to continue being the father she needed and deserved. Ebony's unfulfilled promise was a hard pill to swallow, but it gave me clarity. I had done all I could, and it was time to move forward. Over the years, I watched Ebony spiral further into the same toxic patterns that had defined our past. Despite all the opportunities, all the encouragement I offered, she never seemed to change. I had tried so hard to believe that she could turn things around, to hold on to the hope that one day, she'd finally decide to take responsibility for her life, and for Emma. But as the years went on, that hope began to feel like a cruel joke. The bitter reality was that Ebony never truly wanted to change. She continued to party, to drink, to drown herself in the distractions of the world around her. I knew she had the potential for more. I had seen glimpses of the woman she could have been. The woman who was caring, loving, and capable. But those glimpses were fleeting, buried beneath layers of alcohol, impulsive decisions, and her constant avoidance of facing the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just the drinking or the partying, it was the lack of any real desire to better herself, to become a stable mother, or to build a future for herself and Emma. I reached out countless times, offering support, words of encouragement, and even practical help. "Come on, Ebony, you can do this. You need to get your life together for Emma," I would say. But every time she would push me away. It wasn't just rejection, it was a complete dismissal of anything I had to offer. It wasn't just that she didn't want help, she made me feel like I was the problem, like I was the one who was somehow holding her back. Every time I tried to guide her in a better direction, she turned it against me, accusing me of trying to control her life, of being critical instead of supportive. Her words cut deep, more deeply than I cared to admit. I had always wanted what was best for her, for Emma, for everyone involved. But instead of seeing my concern, she saw it as an attack. She saw my desire for her to be better as an insult to who she was, and the more I tried, the more I felt like I was losing myself in the process. It hurt more than I can put into words. To be dismissed and rejected when all you want is to help. To offer someone everything you have only to be told it's not good enough, or worse, to be made to feel like you're the one who is wrong. It's exhausting. It wears you down over time. But what was perhaps the hardest part was seeing how her behavior affected Emma. Every time Ebony would show up, usually after a long period of silence, it would start with excitement and hope. Emma would run to her mother, eager to reconnect, to rekindle the bond they once shared. But those visits always ended the same way, with disappointment. With Ebony leaving, promising to be back but never following through. And when she did show up again, it was as if she had never been gone. The cycle of hope and hurt continued, wearing Emma down just as it had worn me down over the years. I wanted to shield her from that pain. I wanted to protect Emma from the broken promises and the abandonment. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't control what Ebony did, or didn't do. The reality was that I was left to pick up the pieces, to try and fill the void that Ebony's inconsistency had created in Emma's life. I wasn't just a father to Emma, I was also a mother to her, the one who showed up every day, who made sure she had stability, who fought for her well-being in ways that Ebony couldn't, or wouldn't. Despite all the hurt, I couldn't stop caring for Ebony. She had been a huge part of my life. She was the mother of my child, and I wanted to see her succeed. But the longer I waited for her to change, the more I realized that I couldn't force her to grow, to become the person she could have been. She had to want it for herself, and every time I pushed her, every time I believed in her potential, I was just setting myself up for another disappointment. I had to face the painful truth: Ebony wasn't going to change. She didn't want it badly enough, and I couldn't keep trying to save her. The years had proven that. I wasn't just holding on to a hope that wasn't coming to fruition, I was holding on to a version of Ebony that never truly existed. The woman I had hoped she could be was a figment of my imagination, a version of her that was forever trapped in the past. I realized then that I had spent so much of my life trying to make things right for Ebony and Emma, but in doing so, I had neglected myself. My own needs, my own growth, my own happiness. It wasn't just about Emma anymore, it was about me finding peace, finding stability for my own life, and allowing myself to heal from the emotional damage of the past. And so, I made a choice. I had to stop letting Ebony's failure to change dictate my happiness. I couldn't keep letting her drag me down. I couldn't keep investing my energy into someone who wasn't willing to meet me halfway. The bitter reality was that I had done everything I could for Ebony and for Emma, but I couldn't do it for them anymore. I had to start focusing on my own future, on the life I had built with Maria, and on being the best father I could be to Emma. For years, I had carried the weight of responsibility on my shoulders, shouldering not just the burden of raising Emma, but also the emotional toll of trying to make things work with Ebony. I had been there for her time and time again, offering support even when it wasn't deserved, hoping that one day things would get better. But the truth was, I had been exhausted for a long time. I had given her every chance, every ounce of patience I could muster, only to be let down each time. The promises were never kept, the changes never came. I had spent years giving her opportunities to step up for the sake of our children, but those opportunities were squandered. And eventually, the moment came when I could no longer keep carrying that weight alone. After 5 years of doing everything I could to make sure the kids had what they needed, I came to the painful realization that Ebony had shown no signs of change. She still wasn't contributing to their lives, financially, emotionally, or in any meaningful way. I had given her countless chances to take responsibility for her children, and each time, I had been met with excuses, empty promises, or worse, indifference. It was clear that if I was going to make sure Emma and her sister were taken care of, I couldn't continue to shoulder this burden on my own. So, after much thought and reflection, I made the difficult decision to put Ebony on child support. It wasn't a decision I took lightly. For years, I had avoided it, hoping she would step up and do the right thing without legal intervention. I didn't want to take that step. I didn't want to be the bad guy. But the reality was I couldn't keep doing everything by myself. I was exhausted. I was overwhelmed. And most of all, I was tired of being taken advantage of. I had always believed that co-parenting, even after everything that had happened, was the right thing to do. I had been willing to be generous, to allow Ebony to have her freedom while still providing for the kids. But after 5 years of watching her squander every opportunity to be a good mother, I realized that this wasn't about being generous anymore. It was about fairness. It was about making sure the children had what they needed, and that I wasn't the only one sacrificing. I was already giving everything I had, and now it was time for Ebony to step up, whether she wanted to or not. When I finally took the step of putting her on child support, I felt a mixture of relief and guilt. There was relief because I knew that at least this was a way to ensure that she would contribute, even if it was just financially. And there was guilt because part of me still wanted to believe in her. I didn't want to become the person who had to force her to care for her own children. I wanted her to do it willingly, to step up on her own. But the truth was, she hadn't done that in years, and the time had come to make sure our children were provided for, even if it meant going through the courts. I was met with resistance, of course. Ebony didn't take it well. She saw it as another betrayal, another way I was trying to control her life. But it wasn't about control. It was about accountability. She had had plenty of time and opportunities to do the right thing, and she hadn't. Now, it was time for the law to step in and make sure she fulfilled her responsibility as a mother. The court process was draining as expected. Ebony fought it every step of the way, claiming that she couldn't afford the payments, that I was being unreasonable. She tried to twist the narrative, to make me seem like the villain in the situation. But deep down, I knew that this was what needed to happen. It wasn't about the money, it was about making sure that our kids had what they needed, and that she finally faced some consequences for the years of neglect. I had hoped that this would be the wake-up call Ebony needed to take her role as a mother seriously. I wanted her to stop making excuses and finally step up. Maybe, just maybe, this would force her to acknowledge the impact of her actions and become the person I had always hoped she could be. But even after the child support was set in place, it was clear that Ebony had not changed. She continued to reject responsibility, choosing instead to blame everyone but herself for her situation. I didn't let it deter me, though. I had my own family to take care of now, and Maria and the kids depended on me. I couldn't afford to let Ebony's behavior continue to affect me. The guilt of making that decision eventually faded, replaced by the realization that I had done the right thing. It was the only way I could ensure that Emma and her sister had the stability they deserved. The truth was, I had already been doing the work of two parents for so long, but I couldn't do it all anymore. I had to set boundaries, and sometimes that meant taking a hard stance even if it hurt. The days of giving Ebony handouts were over. It was time for her to take responsibility for the choices she had made. And if she wouldn't do it willingly, I would make sure the system held her accountable. When I filed for child support, I braced myself for the fallout. I knew it would stir up a storm, but nothing could have prepared me for how intense the reaction would be. Ebony, always quick to point fingers and make herself the victim, exploded in a way that shook me. She didn't see this as a simple step to ensure the well-being of her children. Instead, she saw it as a betrayal, another one of those moments where I had done something that went against her narrative. Her world tilted, and she wasn't going to take it lying down. "You're ruining my life," she yelled when I told her what I'd done. "How could you do this to me? I'm already struggling, and now you're just making it worse." I'd expected her to be upset. What I hadn't expected was how deeply personal she would make it. She wasn't angry that she had failed to take care of her children. No, she was furious that I had forced her to face the consequences of her actions. She was angry that I had taken control of the situation. And in her mind, this was a direct attack on her entire existence. It was almost as if the years of irresponsibility, of avoiding any sort of accountability, had built up a wall around her, one that made her believe she could avoid the harsh truths of her actions. And now that wall was being torn down brick by brick, and she couldn't handle it. "I've always been there for our kids," she continued, her voice rising with emotion. "You're taking everything from me. Do you think this is easy for me? You think I don't care?" The irony stung. She hadn't been there for the kids, not in the way that really mattered. She had been absent, emotionally distant, and often reckless. But in that moment, all she saw was the loss of control, the loss of her ability to float by without ever truly having to confront the mess she had created. It wasn't about caring. It was about avoiding responsibility. It was about her being forced to face the truth, a truth she had been running from for years. I tried to stay calm, but her words, her manipulations started to wear on me. I was tired. Tired of the constant drama. Tired of the guilt trips. Tired of being the only one who seemed to care about our children's future. I had been nothing but patient with her for years, always believing that things would eventually get better. But now I was seeing the truth for what it was. She wasn't interested in change. She wasn't interested in being a better mother. She was only interested in maintaining the illusion that everything was fine, that she could keep living her life without ever truly stepping up. And I was done. "You've had years to get it together," I said, my voice steady but firm. "Years to be the mother your kids deserve. I can't keep making excuses for you. All I'm asking for is $180 a month. That's it. I'm not asking you to change the world, I'm asking you to help with your own kids." But that was the thing with Ebony. She didn't want to be held accountable. She didn't want to accept that she had failed. Instead, she lashed out, accusing me of being the bad guy, as if I was the one who had abandoned the kids or let them down. She couldn't see past her own pride, her own feelings of being slighted, long enough to recognize that this wasn't about her. It was about the kids. They were the ones who needed support, and I couldn't do it all on my own anymore. "I can't even afford that," she screamed, as if $180 a month was an impossible burden to bear. "Why should I pay you when you're the one with everything? You think I'm just sitting here living some lavish life?" She had a point, sort of. She wasn't living in luxury. But she wasn't struggling in a way that justified her total neglect of her children either. She wasn't putting any effort into improving her situation. She wasn't trying to find steady work, she wasn't going back to school, and she wasn't building a stable future. And yet, she still felt entitled to everything without having to lift a finger. "It's not about me. It's about the kids," I reminded her, my patience thinning. "They deserve more than what you've been giving them. If you really cared, you'd find a way to contribute. I'm not here to take everything from you, but I'm not carrying this burden alone anymore." But Ebony's anger didn't subside. If anything, it only grew more intense. She accused me of trying to control her life, of wanting to punish her for all the mistakes she had made. She painted me as the villain in this story, the one who was making her life harder than it had to be. She couldn't see that she was the one who had created this mess. She couldn't see that I had been trying to make things work for the kids, for all of us. She spent the next few weeks contacting anyone who would listen. Family members, mutual friends, even my own parents, trying to convince them that I was the one in the wrong. She painted me as cold, heartless, and vindictive. She told everyone how I had ruined her life by taking her to court, by forcing her to pay child support. The narrative was always the same. I was the villain, the one who had failed her. She never once acknowledged the ways in which she had failed us all. The truth was, though, none of this was easy for me either. It was hard to stand firm when I was constantly being painted as the bad guy. It was hard to watch her twist the situation, to see her lie and manipulate others into thinking I was out to get her. But I knew I had made the right choice. The decision to file for child support wasn't about vengeance. It wasn't about getting back at her. It was about doing what needed to be done to ensure the well-being of the kids. In the end, Ebony's reaction didn't change anything for me. The fallout was ugly, but it was necessary. It was the final step I had to take in order to move forward, to reclaim control of my life, and to make sure my children had the support they needed. I wasn't going to let her toxic behavior hold me back anymore. The choice I had made wasn't about being cruel, it was about being responsible for the sake of my children's future. And no matter how much she tried to blame me, I knew that I was finally doing what was best for all of us. While Ebony's life seemed to remain stuck in a perpetual loop of bad decisions and excuses, my wife and I were determined to break free from the patterns of the past. We had learned the hard way that change didn't happen on its own. It required hard work, sacrifice, and a mindset that was focused on growth, not just for ourselves but for the children we were raising together. From the moment we decided to build a future, we committed ourselves fully. We both pursued better jobs, opportunities that would offer us more stability and a chance to provide a life for our kids that was full of the things Ebony never seemed to understand: consistency, love, and responsibility. We worked long hours, sacrificed personal time, and constantly pushed each other to reach new heights. And though it wasn't always easy, there was a quiet satisfaction that came from knowing we were doing everything in our power to create a life of security and happiness for our family. We didn't just focus on our careers, we made a conscious effort to become healthier, both physically and mentally. We made time for exercise, meal prep, and creating routines that would keep us feeling strong and energized. There was no room for excuses. We had learned the hard way what it meant to neglect your well-being, and we refused to go down that path again. Raising our children became our primary focus. We nurtured their growth, ensuring they knew the importance of respect, hard work, and compassion. We spent time with them every day, teaching them the values we had learned along the way. It wasn't just about providing for them financially, it was about being present, being emotionally available, and showing them what it looked like to lead by example. Our children flourished in this environment. They thrived in the stability and love that we worked so hard to give them. It was a far cry from the chaos they had known before. My stepchildren too felt the change. The relationship we had with them was one built on trust and mutual respect, something that was hard to come by in the earlier years of our blended family. Yet, no matter how hard we tried to move forward, Ebony remained an obstacle in our lives. Even though I had hoped for her to find her footing, she seemed to sink deeper into the same unhealthy patterns. She continued to avoid responsibility, and it became more apparent that she had no desire to change. Her life stayed stagnant, and every time I heard about it through mutual acquaintances or our children, it was like a painful reminder of the future I could have had if I hadn't made the decision to leave. But we didn't let that pull us back. My wife and I refused to let Ebony's choices derail the progress we were making. We understood that we couldn't control her actions, but we could control how we responded. We focused on the things we could change, the way we lived, the example we set for our kids, and the way we loved each other. There were moments when I felt resentful, when I wondered why I had to be the one to carry all the responsibility, why I had to be the one to shoulder the weight of raising our kids without her involvement. But I didn't allow those thoughts to consume me. I reminded myself of the bigger picture, the life we were building together. And when I looked at my children, the love we shared as a family, I knew that everything I had done was worth it. Despite Ebony's failures, we grew stronger. We weren't going to let her mistakes define our lives. Every day was an opportunity to improve, to be better. We kept pushing forward, kept striving for more, and kept creating the kind of life we had always dreamed of. A life full of love, hard work, and respect for one another. Looking back, I saw a stark contrast between where we were and where we had come from. The road hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. We had overcome obstacles, both external and internal. And in doing so, we had created something special, something that Ebony couldn't touch or break no matter how hard she tried. Our story was one of resilience, of getting ahead despite the odds. It was about breaking free from the past, moving beyond the toxicity, and building a life that was based on the values that truly mattered. And no matter what Ebony did or didn't do, we knew that our future was in our hands, and we were determined to keep building it, step by step, day by day. It had been years since Ebony and I had exchanged more than a few words. The distance between us was more than just physical. It was emotional, and it had been a long time since I had felt any sense of connection with her. So, when I found out she would have to appear in court for the child support hearing, I was filled with a mix of frustration and reluctant anticipation. I had always hoped that things would change, that Ebony would eventually step up and take responsibility, but over time, it became clear that she was content to let me carry the weight alone. The decision to put her on child support wasn't one I made lightly. I didn't want to go down that road, but after 5 years of carrying the full burden for our children, I had no choice. The lack of financial support was a constant strain, and despite my best efforts to encourage Ebony to do better, she only seemed to spiral further into her own self-destruction. Now, facing her in court, I was reminded of everything she had put me through, every argument, every broken promise, every moment of despair. But this time, I wasn't the same man I had been when we first parted ways. I had learned to stand my ground, to stop apologizing for things I didn't do, and most importantly, to stop letting her control the narrative of my life. Before the hearing, I had tried reaching out to her multiple times, asking her to come see the kids, to at least make some attempt at being a mother to them. I had hoped that maybe, just maybe, she would feel some sense of obligation or guilt and step up for once. But when I reached out, it was as if I was talking to a wall. She didn't respond to my calls, and when she did, her words were filled with excuses, justifications, and blame. I even had to practically beg her to see our children, as if it were a favor I was asking her to do. The thought of it left a sour taste in my mouth, but I pressed on because I knew how important it was for our kids to see that I was fighting for them. For their well-being. For a sense of normalcy, no matter how broken their mother had become. Finally, the day of the court hearing came, and as I sat in the sterile, uncomfortable courtroom, the reality of the situation settled in. Ebony didn't show any signs of remorse or regret when she walked into the room. She barely acknowledged my presence. She was still the same person she had been all those years ago, the one who couldn't accept responsibility for her actions, the one who used others as a scapegoat for her own failures. But this time I didn't flinch. I didn't let her manipulative behavior get under my skin. I had spent too many years letting her control my emotions, and this time I was in control. As we sat there in front of the judge, the tension was palpable. I could feel the weight of all the years of hardship in the air between us. It was as if the past was crowding the room, waiting for its moment to be addressed. Ebony, however, sat there with an almost indifferent expression. There was no apology, no recognition of the toll her choices had taken on me, on our children. She was there only because she had no choice, because the law had finally caught up with her. When the judge asked her about her financial situation, about how she was contributing to the children, her responses were vague and evasive. She couldn't offer any real answers. The judge, however, didn't need much to see through the facade. It was clear that Ebony had nothing to offer, that she had no intentions of improving her circumstances or stepping up as a mother. As the hearing concluded, the judge ruled in my favor, and Ebony was ordered to pay the child support. It wasn't much, $180 a month, but it was something. And that something felt like a small victory, a moment of quiet satisfaction. It wasn't about the money. It was about the principle of it. It was about finally standing up for what was right, for the children I had been raising on my own, for the future that I was working so hard to build. As I left the courtroom, I couldn't help but feel a sense of calm wash over me. The battle wasn't over, but in that moment, I knew I had taken another step forward. Ebony may have walked away without a second thought, but I had walked away with my dignity intact, knowing that I had done what needed to be done. The quiet satisfaction wasn't in winning the court case, but in knowing that I had been the one to step up for our children, that I had done what she refused to do. It was the satisfaction of seeing the truth for what it was, of knowing that I was now free from the toxic grip she had held on me for so long. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally moving on. And with that sense of peace, I knew that no matter what came next, I would be ready. It had been years since I'd seen Ebony, but the moment she walked through the door of my house with her boyfriend, I could feel the weight of the past rushing back. The shock on her face was immediate, unmistakable. It was the look of someone who had never truly believed I would get to where I had. Someone who had underestimated my determination, my resilience. And in that moment, I wanted her to see every bit of it. I wanted her to understand that I had succeeded where she had failed, that I had moved forward without looking back, despite everything we had been through. I had worked tirelessly to build a life for myself, to create a home and a family where love and stability were the foundation. And as I stood there in front of her, I felt a quiet sense of pride in everything I had accomplished. She had once believed that I was weak, that I would never make it without her, that I was just another person who would fall into the same traps that so many others did. But I was living proof that people could change, that they could rise above their circumstances, and that they could create a future that was not defined by their past. The house I had built with my wife was warm, welcoming, and a far cry from the broken, chaotic places Ebony and I had shared. The walls, once bare and cold, were now decorated with memories, family photos, the laughter of our children echoing through the rooms. It was a home, not just a roof over our heads. And as Ebony and her boyfriend took it all in, I could see the realization dawn on her. I wasn't the same person she had left behind. I had grown, I had learned, and I had found happiness in ways I never thought possible. Ebony had always been the type to criticize me, to put me down when I needed encouragement the most. She had never believed in my potential, never saw the strength I had within me. But now as she stood there looking around at what I had built, I knew she couldn't deny the truth. I wasn't the man she had tried to manipulate into submission. I wasn't the person she had thought she could walk all over. I wanted her to see the contrast between where we both had ended up. She had spent years chasing a life that would never come, drifting from one mistake to the next, while I had used every setback, every hardship as fuel to propel myself forward. I wasn't a victim anymore, I was a survivor. And not just a survivor, but someone who had taken control of his life and made something of it. As she wandered around, her eyes scanning the space, I could tell she was comparing it to the way things had been when we were together. I wasn't trying to rub it in her face, I wasn't there to make her feel bad. But I wanted her to understand the gravity of her choices, to see that the opportunity to build something better had been there all along. I had been willing to put in the work, to face the difficult truths, to sacrifice everything for my family. She, on the other hand, had taken a different path, a path that had left her isolated and lost. I didn't need her to apologize or acknowledge the pain she had caused me. What I wanted was for her to recognize that I had taken the lessons I learned from our past and used them to create a future I could be proud of. And deep down, I knew that it was a future she could have had too, if only she had chosen differently. As she sat down on the couch, her boyfriend beside her, I could see the regret in her eyes, the understanding that maybe, just maybe, she had made the wrong choices. But I didn't need her to say anything. The silence between us was louder than any words could have been. I didn't want her back. I wasn't looking for validation. I had moved on and my life had moved forward in ways I never thought possible. But in that moment, I wanted her to know that I had done it without her. I had found my way and I had built something that was better than anything we had shared. I had succeeded where she had failed, and that success was a testament to the person I had become. A person who no longer allowed the past to define him, a person who was in control of his own future. As they left, I didn't feel anger or resentment. I just felt peace. I knew that I had shown Ebony what could have been, but more importantly, I had shown myself what I was capable of. And that was all that mattered. When I led Ebony through the door, I knew this moment was a long time coming. It wasn't about rubbing anything in her face, it was about showing her who I had become, the man I was now, not the person she had left behind. I had come so far and it felt like the culmination of everything I had worked for, the life I had painstakingly built, step by step, piece by piece. I walked her through the house first, showing her each room that my wife and I had designed together. Every corner of the house told a story, of late nights spent working on projects, of finding ways to stretch a dollar, of sacrifices that had been made along the way. But also there was love, laughter, and warmth in every inch of the space. The polished hardwood floors, the cozy fireplace, the children's bedrooms filled with their drawings and toys, these were the things that mattered now. As I spoke to her, walking her through the house, I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't impressed just by the material things, the cars, the land, the expensive furniture, but by the life I had created for myself. The confidence I had now, the peace I had in my heart, was something she hadn't anticipated. I could tell she was searching for cracks, trying to find something to diminish my success, but there was nothing for her to latch onto. I was the man I had promised myself I would become. And then I took her outside. I showed her the land, the property I had built from the ground up, the cars I had worked so hard to own. Every corner of the property reflected a choice I had made to rise above the circumstances of my past. It wasn't about showing off, it was about showing her that I had taken control of my life in ways she never could. As I pointed out the different areas of the property, I saw her face change. Her eyes lingered on the things I had worked so hard for, and I couldn't help but notice the slight hint of envy in her expression. I wasn't looking for her approval, but I wanted her to understand what I had done. When we were together, she never believed I could achieve anything. She was too caught up in her own dysfunction to see the potential in me, to see the ambition I had hidden beneath the surface. But now she was seeing it with her own eyes. The envy wasn't just about the things I had, anyone could buy things, anyone could have material wealth, but it was about the life I had created. It was about the fact that I had turned the pain of our past into something powerful. I had taken all the hurt, all the rejection, and had used it to build a future for my children, for my wife, and for myself. That was the part that she couldn't deny, no matter how hard she tried. There was a certain satisfaction in seeing the truth sink in. I had been the one to rise above, not her. I had been the one who had made something of myself, despite all the odds, despite all the toxic relationships that had threatened to drag me down. It wasn't just the cars or the land or the house. It was the fact that I had become a man who didn't need validation from anyone, a man who didn't rely on anyone else's opinion to define his worth. As I showed her everything I had built, I realized something important. None of this was for her. It wasn't about showing off or proving a point. It was about finally claiming my own success, my own happiness, and my own peace. It was about owning the man I had become and no longer letting my past define me. It was about having confidence in myself, regardless of what she thought, what anyone thought. Ebony had been part of my journey, but she was no longer the focus of my story. I had stopped living for her approval a long time ago. I had stopped letting her choices shape my future. And now, standing there showing her the life I had created, I could see it in her eyes. She knew it too. She knew that she had walked away from someone who had always had the potential to be more. She knew that she had left a man who was capable of greatness, but was too blinded by her own dysfunction to see it at the time. And as I looked at her, I could tell that the envy wasn't just about the things I had, it was about the life I had built. It was about the man I had become. As they left, I didn't feel any satisfaction from her reaction, no sense of triumph. It wasn't about that anymore. It was about knowing that I had succeeded. I had built something real, something solid, something that would last. I had created a future for myself and my children, a future that didn't include her. And that was enough. I had finally become the man I had always dreamed of being, and I knew deep down that no one, especially not Ebony, could take that away from me. As I stood there watching Ebony's reaction to everything I had built, I couldn't help but notice something else, something that was even more meaningful to me. It wasn't just the cars, the house, or the land. It was the woman by my side, the woman who had been with me through the highs and lows, the one who had supported me without hesitation, and the one who had changed right alongside me. Over the years, my wife had worked tirelessly on herself. I had watched her grow in ways that still amazed me. When we first met, she was a woman full of potential, but like me, she had her struggles. But together, we faced those challenges, and over time, we both became stronger versions of ourselves. It wasn't an easy road, but it was worth every step. My wife had transformed. She had found her own voice, her own strength, and had become someone I could always count on. I couldn't help but notice the difference between her and Ebony as we stood there, in the midst of everything I had worked so hard for. My wife had her own sense of purpose, her own quiet confidence. She was grounded, calm, and content in a way that Ebony never could be. It was almost like watching a mirror of who I had been years ago, and seeing who I had become. Over the years, my wife had worked on her career, built her own life, and raised our children with love, patience, and respect. She was no longer just a partner in my life. She was my equal, my confidant, my best friend. We had become a team in the truest sense, supporting each other through every obstacle, sharing our dreams, and building a future together. As I watched Ebony look at her, there was no mistaking it. I saw the jealousy in her eyes. It wasn't just the material success I had achieved, it was my wife, the woman who had stood by me through thick and thin, who had worked tirelessly to become the woman she was now. I could tell Ebony had never expected that. She probably thought I would always be the same, stuck in the past, chasing after dreams that would never come to fruition. But she hadn't counted on my wife. What Ebony didn't realize was that my wife's strength wasn't something you could just take away or diminish. She had worked for every bit of who she was now, just like I had worked for everything I had. Our success wasn't just built on things, it was built on love, hard work, and mutual respect. My wife had been a pillar in our home, nurturing our children, creating a safe and loving environment, and showing me every day what it meant to truly be a partner. And as much as Ebony may have wanted to undermine that, I knew it was clear to her that she couldn't. She had been part of my life, yes, but she had never been able to give me what my wife had. The peace, the stability, the emotional connection, that was something only my wife and I had built together. The jealousy in Ebony's eyes was evident, but it wasn't just about the material things. It was about the bond that my wife and I had developed over the years, a bond that Ebony had never understood, never respected. She had always been so focused on her own chaos and selfish desires that she had missed out on what really mattered. Now, standing next to my wife, I could see it. The difference was clear. The way my wife looked at me, the support and pride in her eyes, was the greatest thing I had. That was what made everything worth it. It wasn't about showing off or proving a point to Ebony, it was about the life I had created with the woman who truly deserved to stand beside me. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my wife was everything I needed. She was the woman who had helped me become the man I had always aspired to be. Together, we had faced the hardships, the doubts, and the failures, and we had come out the other side stronger than we had ever been before. As we all stood there in the midst of everything, I could feel the change in the air. Ebony's jealousy wasn't about what I had, but about the love and respect my wife and I shared. And as much as she might have wished she could have that, she couldn't. That was something that took time, patience, and growth. Not something that could be built from the wreckage of a past filled with lies and dysfunction. I was proud of my wife, proud of the woman she had become, and proud of the life we had built together. She was my rock, my partner, and the one person I could count on no matter what. And now, standing there beside her, I knew that we had come so far, and no one, especially not Ebony, could take that away from us. The change in my wife wasn't just about the success we had built together, it was about the strength we had found in each other. And that was something that Ebony would never understand. As we continued our tour, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. Ebony's face was a mixture of disbelief and resentment as I showed her the life I had built. Every corner of the house, every car parked in the driveway, every small victory along the way, each one felt like a testament to the promise I had made to myself all those years ago. I told you I wouldn't lose, I said, my voice steady, but with a touch of pride. You never believed me, but I made it. I kept my word. Ebony remained silent for a long moment, her eyes scanning the rooms, clearly trying to process the reality in front of her. The life I had created was everything she had never managed to build. She had seen me at my lowest, and now here I was standing in the middle of my success, surrounded by the tangible proof of how far I'd come. And she couldn't deny it. I continued to walk through the rooms, casually pointing out the small details that spoke volumes about how much effort had gone into every part of our home. It was more than just a place. It was a reflection of the years of hard work, sacrifice, and determination that had led me here. It was my reward for never giving up, even when the world tried to break me down. You said I'd never make it, that I'd fail just like everyone else, I added, the weight of those words hanging in the air. But I didn't. I didn't let my past define me. I didn't let you or anyone else hold me back. Ebony's expression softened for a split second, and for the first time in years, I saw a flicker of realization in her eyes. She knew I was right. Despite everything, despite the heartache, the betrayal, and the countless obstacles, I had won. I had come out on top, and that success was mine. It was mine and my wife's, a product of our shared commitment to each other and to the future we were building together. It was the life Ebony had never been able to achieve, and the one she never would. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. You were right, she admitted, her words heavy with defeat. I didn't think you'd make it. I didn't think you could do it. But you did. You really did. I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Her admission was a small victory, but it meant something. It wasn't about rubbing it in her face, it was about proving to myself that I had kept my word. That I had refused to give in to the past and had forged my own future. For a moment, I allowed myself to savor the moment, taking in her admission without saying anything more. There was nothing else I needed to prove. I had done what I set out to do, and that was enough. As we continued walking through the house, I could see the defeat in her posture, the way her shoulders slumped as she took in the life I had built. This was a life I had earned. This was a life I had worked for, fought for, and never once given up on. And as much as I might have once longed for her approval, I no longer needed it. The approval I had always craved came from within. It was the satisfaction of knowing that I had kept my promise. It was the peace that came from knowing I had turned my life around, despite all the doubts and obstacles placed in my path. Ebony's defeat was not something I celebrated, it was simply the reality of our paths diverging. She had made her choices and I had made mine. And while our stories were now worlds apart, there was a sense of closure in this moment. She could see now what I had accomplished, and that was enough. I'm glad you can see it, I finally said, my voice calm. But this wasn't about proving anything to you. It was about proving something to myself. About making sure that I would never lose again. Ebony didn't respond. She didn't need to. The words hung between us, a silent acknowledgement of the years of struggle and sacrifice it had taken to reach this point. And in that moment I realized something profound. The best revenge was not in what I had built, but in the fact that I had found peace. That peace was what truly made all the difference. I had kept my promise, and in doing so, I had gained everything I had ever wanted: self-respect, stability, and the life I deserved. I had thought that showing Ebony the life I had built would be a moment of clarity for her, a wake-up call that might inspire her to make a change. But instead, that moment, where she had quietly admitted I was right, turned out to be the beginning of a much darker chapter in her life. I couldn't have known it then, but the truth of that encounter, seeing the success I had achieved, the life I had created despite the odds, was more than she could bear. She had built so many walls around herself, so many lies to justify the choices she'd made, that seeing the reality of where those choices had led her was like ripping open a wound she had spent years ignoring. In the days that followed our visit, I could feel the shift. Ebony began to distance herself, not just from me but from everything. Her calls grew less frequent, her messages shorter and colder. It wasn't just that she was angry. No, there was something deeper at play. She was unraveling. It started with the drinking. She had always liked to party, but it was different now. The carefree attitude she once had was gone, replaced by a desperation I couldn't ignore. I could hear the slurring in her voice during the occasional phone calls we still had about the kids. Her words would tumble out, mixed with half-hearted attempts at excuses for her behavior. She blamed everything: me, the kids, her circumstances, and even the world at large, but never herself. And yet, somewhere in that haze, I knew she saw the truth. She had lived her life in chaos, never taking responsibility for her actions, never truly trying to change. Now, the reality of her failures, the years lost to bad decisions and unfulfilled promises, was too much for her to confront. The weight of her own shortcomings crushed her. She started drinking heavily, often to the point of blackout. Her texts became erratic, filled with self-pity and anger, each one more desperate than the last. She began calling me late at night, leaving voicemails filled with incoherent ramblings, apologizing one moment, accusing me of ruining her life the next. I listened to them with a growing sense of sadness, not for her but for the woman she had become. She had fallen into a pit of self-doubt and despair, and I knew there was nothing I could do to pull her out. At first I thought maybe it was just a phase. Maybe the shock of seeing me thrive, of seeing what she had lost, was hitting her harder than I'd realized. But weeks turned into months and the spiral only deepened. She tried on occasion to reach out to our kids, but her messages were now filled with empty promises that felt hollow even to them. I couldn't keep watching this. I had tried to help her for years, more than I should have, honestly, and each time I reached out I was met with rejection. Now it was as if the weight of her own failures was finally sinking in. One night I received a call from a mutual friend. They told me that Ebony had been found passed out in her apartment, with a bottle of vodka clutched in her hand. I wasn't shocked. I wasn't even surprised. Deep down I had known she was heading in this direction, but it was still hard to swallow. I had tried so hard to make her see the potential she had, the future she could have, but she had never been able to overcome the self-destructive path she had chosen. When I heard about her latest breakdown, I couldn't help but feel a mix of guilt and relief. I had given up on her for my own sanity, and now the reality of what that meant was staring me in the face. I wasn't responsible for her choices, I knew that. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that I should have done more. That if I'd tried harder, been more patient, maybe she wouldn't have gone down this dark road. But then again, I had to remind myself that I had already given her more chances than most people would have. At some point, I had come to terms with the fact that there was nothing I could do. Her downfall was not a reflection of my failure, it was a result of the choices she had made. No matter how much I wanted to help her, no matter how many times I had reached out, I couldn't save someone who didn't want to be saved. She had to want it for herself, and it was clear by now that she didn't. The sadness I felt wasn't just for Ebony, but for the lost potential I had once seen in her. She was a woman who had once had the world at her feet, full of possibilities. But somewhere along the way she had chosen to throw it all away, and now, there was nothing left but a shadow of the person she could have been. Her descent wasn't just about the drinking, the partying, or the self-destructive behavior, it was the final acceptance of failure. It was the moment when she realized that her choices had caught up with her, and there was no escaping the reality she had built. That realization, that acknowledgement of defeat, was what drove her deeper into the darkness. And as much as I hated seeing her like this, I knew there was nothing more I could do. She had to find her own way out of the darkness, but whether she could or not was a question I couldn't answer. I had already fought my own battle, and I had won. Now it was time for her to fight hers. It had been years since I'd heard from Ebony. The years had passed in silence, each one building on the last, the distance between us growing until it felt like an entire lifetime. She had faded from my thoughts as I focused on my own family, my own life, and the future I had built. The only reminders of her were the occasional moments when our children would bring her up, whether in fondness or in frustration. She was no longer the central figure she once was in my life, and I had accepted that reality. But then came the call. It wasn't a late-night voicemail or a drunken rant this time. It was a voice that was small, fragile, and filled with an overwhelming sense of fear. It was Ebony, and she was calling me from the hospital. I could hear the tremor in her voice, the desperation that she could no longer hide. The woman who once wielded anger and resentment like a weapon now sounded nothing like the person I had known. Her words tumbled out in a frantic rush, but the gravity of what she was saying hit me instantly. I need you to take care of the kids. I don't know how much time I have left. The shock of the moment was paralyzing. For years I had written her off, had moved on from the wreckage of our past, convinced that she was lost to her own choices. And now here she was, reaching out in her final moments, asking me to take responsibility for the children she had failed to care for, failed to nurture, and ultimately failed to love in the way they deserved. Her voice cracked as she explained that her liver was failing, that the damage from years of drinking and neglect had taken its toll. She was scared, more scared than I had ever heard her in our entire history together. The bravado that once masked her insecurities had vanished, replaced by a raw, vulnerable version of the woman I once loved. "Please," she begged, "I'm sorry for everything. I know I've failed you and I've failed them. I don't know how much longer I have, but I need to know they'll be okay. Please, take them." It was surreal listening to her, as if the world had tilted on its axis. I could barely process her words, the weight of them hanging heavy in the air. This wasn't just a plea for help, it was a surrender. For the first time in all those years, Ebony was acknowledging her own defeat, her own inability to provide the kind of life the children needed. But in the back of my mind, a part of me couldn't help but wonder, was this just another manipulation? Was she trying to absolve herself of the guilt she had carried for so long, in the final moments of her life? Was she truly scared, or was this just another way of trying to control the narrative one last time? Still, in that moment as I listened to the quiet sobs on the other end of the line, I knew what I had to do. The pain of her past failures, the frustration I had carried for so long, all seemed insignificant in the face of what was now a stark, undeniable truth. My children, our children, needed to be cared for. And if she was asking me to step up in the way she never had, then I would. I owed it to them to make sure their futures weren't tainted by the same mistakes that had wrecked her life. I'll take care of them, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. You don't have to worry about them. I'll make sure they're okay. But you need to get better, Ebony. For your own sake. And for theirs. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone. Then, in a whisper, she spoke, the words heavy with a sorrow I hadn't heard from her in years. Thank you. I'm sorry for everything. I hung up the phone, my mind racing with a mixture of emotions. I felt anger, sadness, and a sense of finality, but most of all, I felt nothing. There was no triumph in her plea, no satisfaction in knowing that I had finally won. I had always believed that the satisfaction of being the better person would bring closure, but now it felt hollow. Ebony's descent had consumed so much of her life, and there would be no neat resolution, no perfect ending to the story we had shared. I couldn't help but think of our children. The years of absence, the moments they had missed with their mother, the emotional scars they carried because of her decisions. And now she was asking me to take over once again, as if her failures could be erased in an instant. I didn't want to resent her, but I couldn't ignore the years of pain and neglect. I had already carried so much of the weight for them, for us. And yet, I knew that this was different. She wasn't just asking for forgiveness, she was asking for a second chance, not for herself, but for them. And in that moment, that was all that mattered. It wasn't going to be easy. There would be difficult conversations, feelings of betrayal, and perhaps some bitterness to deal with. But I had made a promise to myself long ago that I wouldn't lose. And now, that promise wasn't just about me, it was about the children I loved, the family I had built, and the legacy I would leave behind. Ebony had made her choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. She had reached out for help, whether out of guilt, desperation, or a final plea for redemption, I didn't know. But I wasn't going to let the children suffer because of the mistakes of their past. I would take care of them, I would honor my promise to be the father they deserved, and in the end, I would show them the strength of a love that wasn't defined by mistakes, but by the resilience to keep moving forward. The call had marked the end of one chapter, but it was also the beginning of another. 2 days. That was all the time Ebony had left after that fateful phone call. I had expected to feel a sense of relief or at least some closure. After all, her choices had led her down this path. The years of neglect, the endless cycles of self-destructive behavior, and the weight of the hurt she had caused, it all seemed to point to this inevitable ending. But when I heard the news of her passing, it wasn't relief that washed over me. Instead, it was a flood of conflicting emotions: regret, sorrow, guilt. Ebony was gone. The woman who had been part of my life, for better or worse, for so many years, was no longer here. The mother of my children, a person I had once loved, was now a memory, one I had no more power to shape or change. And with her passing, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I had missed, something I should have done differently. I had done my best over the years, but I couldn't help but wonder, could I have done more for her? Was there something I could have said, some way I could have reached her before the downward spiral consumed her completely? I had promised I wouldn't lose, and I had stuck to that promise. I had made sure our children were safe, that they were loved, and that they wouldn't be harmed by the chaos she had left behind. But in her final days, when she reached out, I hadn't been able to save her. I hadn't been able to make her believe in herself, in the possibility of a different life. It wasn't that I had expected a miracle. I knew Ebony had made her choices long before that call, but that didn't stop the sting of guilt. I had seen her in such a vulnerable state, heard her plead for help, but despite everything, there was nothing I could do to erase the years of damage she had done to herself. She had spent so much of her life pushing people away, and in the end, that isolation had caught up to her. The guilt I felt was a heavy weight on my chest. I could feel it like a physical presence pressing down on me, especially as I thought of our children. They would never have the chance to know their mother in the way they deserved. The absence of that bond would be something they would carry with them forever. I could try to fill the void, but I couldn't replace the woman who had given them life. And the knowledge that I had failed her, at least in the moments that truly mattered, gnawed at me. I wanted to be angry, to feel nothing but resentment for the pain she had caused. I had every right to feel that way. She had hurt me, hurt the kids, and sabotaged everything we could have had. But now that she was gone, the anger felt empty. It was replaced with something more complicated: sorrow for the woman who had been so lost, so far from the person she could have been. I mourned not just the woman she had become, but the woman she might have been if things had gone differently. I spent those first few days after her death in a kind of numb disbelief. I didn't cry at first. I think I was still trying to process the finality of it all. The woman who had once been a central figure in my life, who had shared moments of love and laughter with me, was now gone. And yet, it was hard to feel like there was any justice in her death, no grand sense of rightness or satisfaction in knowing that she had paid for her mistakes. It just felt like an overwhelming loss. Not just for me but for our children too. I kept thinking back to that last conversation we had. The one where she admitted her failures, the one where she had finally shown vulnerability, a side of her I had rarely seen. I had heard the words of regret, but I never expected her death to come so soon after. It was as if she had only just begun to realize the enormity of her choices, but it was too late to change anything. At the same time, I couldn't help but feel grateful that she had reached out to me at the very end. In her own broken way, she had made an attempt to make things right. And while it didn't undo the years of damage, it gave me something I never expected: peace with the past. I had made sure our children would be taken care of, that they would be surrounded by love and stability. And even though Ebony's passing was tragic, I could rest knowing that I had done everything I could for her in those final moments. The guilt lingered for a long time, but so did the understanding that no one's life, no one's story, is ever completely written in the way we think it should be. Sometimes all we can do is carry the weight of the past, and honor the lessons it has taught us. Ebony's death was a painful chapter in both my life and our children's lives, but I realized that it was no longer mine to fix. It was her story, and in the end I could only control how I moved forward. And so I did. I made sure our children were taken care of. I made sure they understood that despite their mother's absence, they were not defined by it. They were not the sum of her mistakes, but the culmination of the love and stability we had created in their lives. I couldn't undo the past, but I could guide them to a future where they knew their worth, where they knew that they were more than what their mother had left behind. And in that way I could honor the promise I had made all those years ago, that I would not lose. Not to her, not to anyone. Not ever again. Months had passed since Ebony's death, and life had moved forward in a way I had never imagined. The weight of everything, the pain, the guilt, the memories, was still there, lurking just beneath the surface. There were days when I could almost forget about it, when the chaos of everyday life seemed to drown out the echoes of the past. But there were other days, quiet days, when I found myself alone with my thoughts, and I couldn't escape the question that haunted me: could I have done more? One afternoon, after a long week of working, I found myself thinking about Ebony's boyfriend, the man she had been with in her final years. I hadn't heard from him since her passing, and I realized I had no idea how he was coping. We hadn't exactly been close, but in the wake of her death, I couldn't help but wonder how much of her pain he had seen, how much of it he had known. After everything that had happened, I felt a strange need to reach out to him, to check on him, to see if he was doing okay. I called the number I had for him, not sure what to expect. When he answered, there was a hesitation in his voice, followed by a quiet recognition. "Hello?" I greeted him awkwardly, unsure of what to say. He seemed surprised to hear from me, but after a few moments of small talk, I asked how he was doing and how he had been coping with Ebony's death. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice was low, almost reluctant. She didn't really talk much about what was going on. I mean, I knew she was struggling with some stuff, but I didn't realize how bad it had gotten. He said, almost as if speaking to himself. My heart sank. I had hoped, naively perhaps, that maybe he had been aware of the depth of Ebony's pain, that maybe, together, they had tried to help her in those final years. But his words told me something I already feared. She had hidden her struggles from everyone, even the man she had been with. She had carried her burdens alone, and in the end, it seemed that she had done the same with me. She reached out to me, but had anyone else truly known the extent of her pain? I stayed silent for a moment, trying to process what he had said. There was so much I still didn't understand about the last years of Ebony's life. It was a part of her I would never truly know, and perhaps that was the hardest part of it all. Realizing that, despite everything we had been through together, there were still pieces of her I would never have access to. I didn't know she was that bad off, he continued. I wish I could have helped her more. Maybe I could have done something. His words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. Here I was, carrying the guilt of not doing enough for her, but so was he. We had both failed in our own ways. And yet, neither of us had the full picture of what had been happening behind the scenes. Ebony had been living in a world of isolation, even with people around her. It was as if she had built walls so high no one could reach her, until it was too late. The conversation left me with more questions than answers. Why had she hidden everything from him? Why had she reached out to me in her final moments? And the most painful question of all, why hadn't I seen the depth of her suffering sooner? The guilt I had been carrying for months became even heavier after that phone call. It wasn't just about whether I could have done more for Ebony, it was the realization that even when she reached out, I wasn't the only one she had hidden things from. And I couldn't help but wonder if I had somehow failed her in the most important way by not seeing through her defenses, by not understanding the full extent of her pain. It gnawed at me. It made me question every decision I had ever made in our relationship, every moment I had tried to distance myself, to protect myself from the toxicity. I had kept my distance for my own sanity, but was that the right thing to do? Could I have been more patient, more understanding? Could I have done something, anything, that might have prevented the tragic end to her story? The truth was, I would never know. The choices she made, the paths she took, were hers alone. I couldn't rewrite her past, and I couldn't change the way things had played out. But that didn't stop the guilt from consuming me in waves. As I sat with these thoughts, I realized that there was something I had to come to terms with. I couldn't save everyone. I had saved myself. I had built a life that I could be proud of, a life that was filled with love, stability, and a future for my children. But in the end, Ebony had made her own choices, and those choices had led her down a path I couldn't follow. The guilt would never truly go away. It would always be there, lingering in the background, a reminder of what could have been. But I knew deep down that I had done what I could. I had been there when it mattered most, and I had kept my promise to never lose. And perhaps that was the best I could do for her in the end.